Hello everyone, welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. And in this lecture video I want to talk about the idea of texture. So texture is probably one of the most, in my opinion, confusing elements of image interpretation because it has this sort of direct analog to the real world, but at the same time the way that we quantify it can be a little bit confusing if you don't have a solid understanding of what remote sensing data is and the remote sensing data structure. But at sort of the largest, sort of broadest stroke, when we talk about texture, the way that you typically will hear it described in terms of image interpretation is this idea of how would the object feel, right? And you can imagine sort of conceptually, if you could reach through your computer screen or reach through an image and run your hand across whatever object you're looking at. And so texture at that broad level is, well, how would it feel? And you'll typically hear things like rough, smooth, right? Sometimes you'll hear striated, right? These are all things that you're used to, like if you were to touch your t-shirt or your jeans or an object on your table, right? Those are the sorts of terms that you're used to using in everyday life, and that's sort of the same idea of what we're trying to convey in remote sensing in terms of texture. But the way that we actually sort of, the nuts and bolts of texture has more to do with variation in pixel values. Right, and so if something is rough, right, if you would describe something as rough, typically what that means is there's a high variation in pixel values. Right, if we were to describe something as smooth, right, this would mean there's a low variation in pixel values. Or to sort of put another way, where when we say there's a high variation in pixel values, this would mean many colors. Or maybe a lot of different hues or shades of the same color. Whereas smooth, right, a low variation in pixel values means there's going to be a few colors. Or another way to put it, there's a smaller range in the hues of a color. And something like striated, which I would encourage you to Google if you don't understand what striated means texture-wise. Right, this would be sort of rough with a pattern. Right, where this variation in pixel values occurs in a directionality. So for example, when we talked about apple orchards, right, we said that had a linear pattern. Well, if you were to run your hand across that pattern, right, you could sort of imagine this as feeling sort of rigid or ridgy. Like each of those little rows would be like a ridge. And then the field underneath would be smooth, right? That's an example of striated texture. Now, what I want to do, and again, I think this is probably the most complicated element of image interpretation, so I want to go through several examples. First, I want to skip down to here, and I want to talk about this idea of fields versus trees, right? These are both vegetation, but the idea of this area here, right, versus this area here. Right. So you would imagine, hopefully, that if you were able to reach through your TV monitor or your computer monitor and touch this area here, you would imagine that this area might feel more smooth, right? As would most lawns and fields and athletic fields, right? You would imagine they would feel relatively smooth. Versus if you were to run your hand across this, which is a clump of trees, right? This would be more rough. Right, and you can see that because you have a lot more variation in pixel values, right? Here we don't have that much shadow. It's all sort of this shade of green and a little bit of brown. Whereas here we have a lot of shadow peppered in. We have a lot of light greens and dark greens, right? We have a lot of variation in color. So this just looks a lot more rough than this does, right? That's the idea of texture. So let's take another look at something a little more complicated. And also talk about this idea of scale. So before, when we looked at an image like this, we would have picked out something like this here. We would have said this is a baseball diamond based on the shape. Or we might have picked something like this little area right here. We would have said this is a lawn based on the color. But what I want to do now is I want to talk about texture at sort of a farther out level. And I want to compare sort of three regions. I want to compare this region over here, with this region over here, maybe not all the way down there, with this region here, and then I want to compare it to a nearby region, right? This is taken from the same imagery, just slightly over, with this region here. I want to talk about this image in terms of variability. And in specific, I want to say, well, what kind of region is this? What kind of region is this? And what kind of region is this? So again, if we think about it, right, this region right here has high variability, right? There's a lot of colors. There's shades of green, there's shades of gray, there's shadow. Right, so this would probably, on a scale in terms of variation, right, this would have the most variation. So this is going to be, right, this is going to be a suburban area. Right, we have trees, we have houses, we have roads. This is going to be suburban. Right, this area has a decent amount of variation, right? It's got some grays, it's got some blacks, this is going to be an urban area. So it's going to have moderate variation. And then I want to look at this area over here. Right, this area over here. So this is obviously this is a forested area. And you can see here that this actually has some variation, right? But it's not as much as this area or this area, right? The range of colors is not as much. Right? This is all shades of green. This is shades of green and shades of gray. This is more shades of gray. Right? So this would be lower variation. And this would be a forested area. Or this would be a forested area, right? Maybe like a park or a natural area, right? And so what I'm trying to get at here is that it's not just zooming in to just say this baseball diamond here, right? We can apply these elements of image interpretation to larger geographic regions, like say an urban area or a suburban area or a forested area. And we can apply this same idea of texture at different scales. So just to sort of recap, right? Here we're looking at very small area. We're looking at a farm field and the surrounding trees, and we would say that this is rough and this is smooth, right? Smooth, rough. But then if we go to this, right, the idea of smooth and rough doesn't really apply in the same way. We have to think about it in terms of variation, right? Where we would have this would be moderate variation, right? This would be high variation because we have greens and grays, right? And this would be relatively low variation because it's all more or less a single shade of green. I know this is a little complicated. Hopefully this idea of these two different sort of spatial scales makes sense and how we transitioned away from how it feels to the idea of variation in color. Hopefully this makes sense, and as always, please reach out. Thank you.